Chapter 2. Operation Husky. The 1st Armored Corps, which planned the Sicilian campaign, was what remained of Western Task Force headquarters after furnishing men and officers for the newly created Fifth Army. Corps headquarters was reinforced for the invasion, and upon landing in Sicily was renamed United States 7th Army Headquarters. The Allied ground forces were commanded by General Sir Harold Alexander and comprised the British 8th Army under General Montgomery and the United States 7th Army under General Patton. The American and British naval forces were commanded by Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham and the air forces by Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder. The armies were landed on July 10, 1943, with the British 8th Army taking the southeast side of the island and the American 7th the southwest. Troops of the 7th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Division, Colonel H.B. Sherman commanding, entered Messina on the night of August 16th. On the morning of the 17th, General Patton entered the city and Sicily fell. The campaign had lasted 38 days.
The Invasion of Sicily, July 11th, 1943. General Gay, Captain Stiller and I, and some soldiers left the Monrovia in the Admiral's barge at 0900 and reached the beach at Gela at 0930. Standing on the beach, I noticed 2 ducks, amphibious 2.5-ton trucks, destroyed by personnel mines, and about 7 small landing craft beached. While I was making these observations, the enemy opened fire with what was probably an 88mm or 105mm gun. The shells hit the water about 30 yards from the beach, but could not get into the beach on account of the defilade afforded by the town. After our scout car was de-waterproofed, I intended to go to the headquarters of the 1st Division, about 3 miles to the southeast along the coast road. As we got into Gela, we noticed a flag on the left and decided to call on Colonel W.O. Darby, commanding the Rangers. This was very fortunate because, had we proceeded down the road, we should have run into 7 German tanks, which at that moment were advancing along it toward the town. As we arrived at the Rangers' command post, Colonel Darby and the town of Gela were being attacked from the northeast by quite a number of Germans and Italians. Darby had a battery of captured German 77s, K Company of the 3rd Battalion of the 26th Infantry, 2 Ranger battalions, a company of 4.2 chemical mortars, and a battalion of the 39th Engineers. He was cut off from the 1st Division on his right by the 7 tanks, which now closed in to 1,000 yards of the right side of the town. We went up to an observation post, about 100 yards behind the front line, where we could plainly see the enemy moving across the field, perhaps 800 yards away. Darby had the roads patrolled by groups of 3 half-tracks. These half-tracks, intended not for combat but to carry engineers' equipment, worked very well, greatly annoying the Italians, who apparently had no mobile artillery with them. The Italian advance seemed to stick at about 11:50, and we went back to Darby's headquarters to find out what was taking place on the right, which we could see from the town of Gela. About the time we got there, 2 Hurricane bombers dropped bombs in the town. Then German artillery, apparently 88mm all-purpose guns, opened fire. They hit the building we were in twice, and also made a hole in the roof of the building across the street, but no one was hurt except some civilians. I have never heard so much screaming. About that time, an officer from the 3rd Division came in with 10 tanks, having made the trip by the shore road from Licata to Gela. 2 tanks of Combat Command B also arrived. I told Gaffey to close the gap between Gela and the 1st Division, and to send a company of tanks to help Darby. This was done. Darby counterattacked at once to his left and took 500 prisoners. We also destroyed the 7 tanks east of Gela. After I got the situation of the 3rd Division from the officer who had made the trip, General Roosevelt arrived, and I talked to him about the failure of the 1st Division to carry its objective last night. The chief reason, as far as I can see, is that the division attacked without anti-tank guns and without moving up their artillery. When they were counterattacked by the German tanks, they did very well and accounted for quite a few of them. The bag of enemy tanks for the day is, I think, about 14. I have seen 11. I then decided to go down and see General Allen and General Gaffey. While we were driving down the road, we met Allen coming in and halted on a hill. This was about 15:30. While we were there, 14 German bombers came over and were attacked by the anti-aircraft. We got off the road, but as it was parallel to the line of flight of the enemy airplanes, quite a number of fragments from the anti-aircraft hit along the road. One piece struck within, I should think, 5 to 10 yards of General Gay and myself. During this attack, we saw 2 bombers and 1 other plane shot down. After this, we mounted our cars and drove to the headquarters of the 2nd Armored Division. While we were there, a German battery kept shelling us, but not very accurately, or else the hill behind was too high to clear, as nearly all of the shots were overs. We arranged for Allen and Gaffey to take Ponte Olivo airfield in the morning. We then drove back to Gela without incident, except that I think it is quite unusual for an army commander and his chief of staff to travel some 6 miles on a road parallel to the fronts of 2 armies and about equally distant from the 2. On the way back to Gela, I happened to be looking out to sea. From a Liberty freight ship, which the Germans had bombed about a half hour earlier, smoke was issuing. Before our eyes, a tremendous explosion threw white and black clouds several thousand feet into the air. The ship was literally blown in 2, but at the present writing, some 6 hours later, the rear half is still afloat. Most, if not all, of the Army personnel on board, who numbered only 115, were saved. While we were on the beach at Gela, waiting for a boat to take us out to the Monrovia, I saw the most stupid thing I have ever seen soldiers do. There were about 300 500-pound bombs and 7 tons of 20-millimeter high-explosive shell piled on the sand, and in between the bombs and boxes of ammunition, these soldiers were digging foxholes. I told them that if they wanted to save the Graves registration burials, that was a fine thing to do, but otherwise they'd better dig somewhere else. About the time we got through explaining this to them, 2 Hurricane bombers came over and strafed the beach, and all the soldiers jumped right back into the same holes they'd dug. I continued to walk up and down and soon shamed them into getting up. We got back to the Monrovia at 1900, completely wet. This is the first day in this campaign that I think I earned my pay. July 18th, 1943. Since the initial successful assault on the beaches before daylight on the 10th, we've continued to push along several days ahead of our assumed schedule. This has been due to the fact that having once got the enemy started, we have not let him stop, but have, so to speak, kept on his heels. It is also due to the fact that the Italians and Germans spent tremendous effort in time, labor, and money building defensive positions. I am sure that, just as in the case of the walls of Troy and the Roman walls across Europe, the fact that they trusted to defensive positions reduced their power to fight. Had they spent 1/3 as much effort in fighting as they did in building, we never could have taken the positions. On the other hand, the Italian troops, most of whom are from northern Italy, have fought very desperately. The German troops have not fought as well as those we destroyed in Tunisia. This is particularly true of their tanks. They have shown gallantry, but bad judgment. The tally of prisoners, guns, etc. speak more forcefully than words as to the success of the operation. While comparisons are odious, I believe that up to yesterday the 8th Army had not taken over 5,000 prisoners. The enemy has been booby-trapping his dead, firing on us from the rear after we've passed through him, and using dum-dum bullets. This has caused us some casualties, but has caused him a great deal more. On the field south of Biscari Airport, where we had quite a fight, I could smell dead enemy while driving for at least 6 miles along the road. The Germans have, on several occasions, put mines in behind the Italians, so that when the Italians attempt to run, they get blown up. This naturally does not make the Italians love the Germans. There have been several very gallant instances. On the 10th, some Italian tanks entered the town of Gela, which was defended by Colonel Darby and 2 battalions of Rangers. Darby personally engaged one of the tanks at 50 yards with a light machine gun from his peep. When he found that these bullets would not penetrate, he hurried down to the beach, under fire of 3 tanks, got hold of a 37mm gun just unloaded, split the box of ammunition with an axe, hurried back up the hill, and went into position with his gun less than 100 yards in front of a tank coming down on him. The first round failed to stop the tank, but the second did stop it. However, the enemy crew did not get out until Darby put a thermite grenade on top of the tank and roasted them out. The other day, this same officer was offered the command of a regiment with an increase of 1 grade in rank, but he refused to take it because he wished to stay with the men he had trained. On the same day, General Wiedemeyer requested to be reduced to a colonel so that he could take command of a regiment. I consider these 2 acts outstanding. During the landing, an artillery lieutenant flew his Piper Cub off a landing boat with a run of about 50 feet of chicken wire. During the rest of the day, he circled the town under continuous fire. His plane was hit several times, but he kept the commanding general of the 3rd Division informed of the situation. A naval officer bringing in an LCT 175-foot landing craft found the water too shallow to get his bow in, so he broached it to the beach and engaged the enemy machine guns with his 2 20mm cannon and silenced them, thereby permitting the troops to get ashore. The naval gunfire support, that is, naval fire put on the beaches from vessels at sea, has been outstanding. We have even called for this support at night and got it on the target on the 3rd salvo. The people of this country are the most destitute and God-forgotten people I've ever seen. One day, when I was in the town and the enemy nearly took it, some shells and bombs killed a few civilians, and everyone in the town screamed like coyotes for about 20 minutes. The animals are much better cared for and fatter, and also larger, than the animals in Africa. Otherwise, everything here is much worse than in Africa. The carts are very peculiar. They are in the form of a box about 4 feet square with things that look like bedposts at the corners and along the sides. The panels between these bedposts are painted with pictures. Under the cart, there is a scrollwork built up between the axle and the bottom of the box, just like the porches of houses built around 1880. The collar of the cart animal has a spike projecting upwards about 2 feet, and many of the horses wear plumes on the crown piece of the bridle. During the first 2 or 3 days, when we were having fighting close to the towns, the inhabitants were, to say the least, not friendly. But since we have demonstrated that we can destroy either the Germans or Italians, they have become quite Americanized and spend their time asking for cigarettes. The Capture of Palermo, July 23, 1943. On the afternoon of the 21st, we secured a position northeast of Castelvetrano, from which to launch the 2nd Armored Division, which heretofore had been held back near the middle of the island so that the enemy could not tell which way it was going. The troops moved into position beginning at 4 p.m. and were all set by dark. In the morning they started their relentless advance. The first act was to break through the enemy on his immediate front. This was done by the 41st Infantry, supported by a battalion of medium tanks from the 66th. This started the enemy rolling back. From then on, it was a question of attacking him with converging tanks whenever he tried to stop us, which he attempted on 3 occasions. In one case, a 75mm assault howitzer in a half-track engaged a German 105 at 500 yards and destroyed him. This act was as lucky as it was heroic. The last stand was made in the mountains southwest of Palermo, which was a most difficult nut to crack, but was finally done with artillery fire and tanks. We met some of the most ingenious tank traps I've ever seen. The Germans would dig a hole about 18 feet long and 10 feet deep, halfway across the right side of the road, and cover it with chicken wire and dust to make it look like the road. Then, about 30 feet beyond, on the left-hand side of the road, they would make a similar pit. In front of each pit, they would put a wire entanglement, with the hope that our tanks would disregard the wire and crash into the holes. Fortunately, we did not do so. In other places, they dug traps about 20 feet wide and 15 feet deep for distances of several miles. But by sticking to the roads and blasting our way through, we had no trouble with them. I drove up through the column and received a very warm reception from the 2nd Armored, all of whom seemed to know me, and all of whom first saluted and then waved. As we neared the city, it was dark, so I picked up Colonel R.F. Perry, Chief of Staff of the division, to act as a guide. He stated he believed the town had fallen, and we therefore decided to go in and see. As we approached, the hills on each side were burning. We then started down a long road cut out of the side of a cliff, which went through an almost continuous village. The street was full of people shouting, "Down with Mussolini," and "Long live America." When we got into the town, the same thing went on. Those who arrived before dark, among them General Keyes, had flowers thrown on the road in front of them, and lemons and watermelons given them in such profusion that they almost became lethal weapons. The governor had left, but we captured the 2 generals, both of whom said that they were glad to be captured because the Sicilians were not human beings but animals. The bag in prisoners for the day must have been close to 10,000. On the morning of the 23rd, when I was inspecting the harbor, I passed a group of prisoners, all of whom stood up, saluted, and then cheered. The harbor is not too badly damaged, but the destruction around the lip is really appalling. For about 2 blocks in depth, practically every house is a pile of rocks. Some ships, small fishing steamers, were apparently blown completely out of the water and landed on the dock. At least I can account for their being there in no other way. A good many of the small craft in the harbor are sunk, several of them being cut completely in 2. We took over the so-called Royal Palace for a headquarters and had it cleaned by prisoners for the first time since the Greek occupation. We are also having the prisoners remove the rubbish from the streets and plug the holes in the dock. The Italians here are much better looking than the ones we took in the rest of Sicily, being bigger and older. The Cardinal's vicar came to call on me, and I assured him that I was amazed at the stupidity and gallantry of the Italian army. Stupid because they were fighting for a lost cause, and gallant because they were Italians. I asked him to tell them that and to spread the rumor. I further said that we had demonstrated our ability to destroy them, and if they failed to take the hint and surrender, we would certainly do so. As a matter of fact, I called off the air and naval bombardment we had arranged, because I felt enough people had been killed, and felt that with the drive of the 2nd Armored Division, we could take the place without inflicting unproductive losses on the enemy. I believe that this operation will go down in history, certainly at Leavenworth, as a classic example of the proper use of armor. And I also believe that historical research will reveal that General Keyes' corps moved faster against heavier resistance and over worse roads than did the Germans during their famous Blitz. We did not waste any time, however, and started this morning, capturing the North Road and also moving artillery to support the final effort of the 2nd Corps, which will begin in a few days. Headquarters 7th Army, U.S. Army, August 1st, 1943. General Order Number 10, to be read to troops. Soldiers of the 7th Army and 12th Air Support Command. Landed and supported by the Navy and Air Force, you have, during 21 days of ceaseless battle and unremitting toil, killed and captured more than 87,000 enemy soldiers. You have captured or destroyed 361 cannon, 172 tanks, 928 trucks, and 190 airplanes. You are magnificent soldiers. General Eisenhower, the Commander-in-Chief, and General Alexander, the Army Group Commander, have both expressed pride and satisfaction in your efforts. Now, in conjunction with the British 8th Army, you are closing in for the kill. Your relentless offensive will continue to be irresistible. The end is certain and is very near. Messina is our next stop. G.S. Patton, Jr., Lieutenant General, U.S. Army Commanding. Headquarters 7th Army, U.S. Army, August 22, 1943. General Order Number 18. Soldiers of the 7th Army. Born at sea, baptized in blood and crowned with victory, in the course of 38 days of incessant battle and unceasing labor, you have added a glorious chapter to the history of war. Pitted against the best the Germans and Italians could offer, you have been unfailingly successful. The rapidity of your dash, which culminated in the capture of Palermo, was equaled by the dogged tenacity with which you stormed Trollina and captured Messina. Every man in the army deserves equal credit. The enduring valor of the infantry and the impetuous ferocity of the tanks were matched by the tireless clamor of our destroying guns. The engineers performed prodigies in the construction and maintenance of impossible roads over impassable country. The services of maintenance and supply performed a miracle. The Signal Corps laid over 10,000 miles of wire, and the medical department evacuated and cared for our sick and wounded. On all occasions, the Navy has given generous and gallant support. Throughout the operation, our air has kept the sky clear and tirelessly supported the operation of the ground troops. As a result of this combined effort, you have killed or captured 113,350 enemy troops. You have destroyed 265 of his tanks, 2,324 vehicles, and 1,162 large guns, and in addition have collected a mass of military booty running into hundreds of tons. But your victory has a significance above and beyond its physical aspect. You have destroyed the prestige of the enemy. The President of the United States, the Secretary of War, the Chief of Staff, General Eisenhower, General Alexander, General Montgomery, have all congratulated you. Your fame shall never die. G.S. Patton, Jr., Lieutenant General, U.S. Army Commanding. Sidelights on the Sicilian Campaign, October 1943. Now that sufficient time has elapsed, it is permissible for me to give you a general idea of the lighter side of the Sicilian campaign and subsequent incidents. The first intimation I had that we were in the transport area was when the davit for a landing boat gave way and the boat crashed into my porthole. For a moment we thought that a bomb had hit. As we were sleeping in full pack, we went on deck. The whole coastline, as far as we could see, was a mass of flames. In some places they looked like burning mountains. In other places, simply like a line of fire. At intervals along the flaming shore, searchlights would suddenly flare and sweep the water. This was very interesting because, while the lights made it so bright on deck that we could read a paper, the enemy was apparently unable to see us from the land. I think that this had something to do with refraction and the haze caused by the fires. Whenever one of these searchlights flickered on, innumerable tracer bullets from our destroyers and patrol boats hurried toward it like bees returning to a hive. That searchlight immediately went out. The fires along the shore, we discovered, were caused by our high explosives igniting the wheat fields. Fortunately for the Sicilians, the wheat had been harvested, but the stubble was still there, and that is what burned. The southern Sicilian is, if possible, the dirtiest of all Sicilians. There were actually cases in which they lived with corpses in their houses for several days because they were too lazy to remove them. Yet, when we used post-hole diggers to bury them, they were very angry and said the dead should be buried horizontally and not vertically. We gave them the opportunity of horizontal burial by permitting the civilians to dig the graves. In the courtyard back of the house I occupied, I once counted 8 children, 11 goats, 3 dogs, a flock of chickens, and a horse, all picking up filthy scraps from the pavement. None of them seemed to die. I suppose people that have been raised on tomato sauce made after the Sicilian manner are immune. Their method of preparing this sauce is to collect tomatoes, many of them overripe, and squeeze them out with their hands onto old sheets or pieces of paper or doors or anything else they can find. They leave this bloody-looking mess for several days and then put it on trays, usually lying on the sidewalks, to dry. Since the streets are never cleaned, there is plenty of germ-laden dust to mix with the sauce. This is the thing with which they eat their macaroni. The Italians under German tutelage were extremely clever in the construction of pillboxes. In fact, in many cases they were too clever, because they camouflaged them with hay or bushes, and our first phosphorus shells set them on fire. In other cases, they went to the trouble of building stucco houses outside of the pillboxes. In order to put the latter into action, they simply gave the wall a kick, and there was the pillbox. In spite of the tremendous number of these things, we had practically no trouble in destroying them. One battalion alone got 39 in one day. Owing to the lack of water and other causes, we decided to drink champagne while at Gela, and secured a case, which would seem ample, but owing to the large number of visiting firemen, it disappeared in about 2 days. It was then necessary to secure more champagne. In order to do this, the dealer, who was a bootlegger, had to be got out of jail through the interposition of the bishop. After he was removed from jail long enough to sell us more champagne, he obligingly returned to his cell. Agrigento was one of the earliest Greek cities, as later it was to be one of the earliest Carthaginian cities. At Agrigento there are 3 very beautiful Greek temples, one to Juno, one to Concordia, and one to Hercules. There is also a sacred way connecting these temples, bordered on each side by rock-hewn tombs, now all pilfered. The mayor of the town, who was by way of being an archaeologist, took me to look at these temples. When we came to the Temple of Hercules, which was the biggest but in the worst state of repair, I asked him if it had been destroyed by an earthquake. He said, "No, General, it was an unfortunate incident of the other war." When I asked which was the other war, he said that this temple was destroyed in the Second Punic War. The emergence of the Carthaginians at Agrigento in 470 B.C. is of interest as showing that global war is not new. At that time, Carthage owed a sort of lip service alliance, or in fact vassalage, to Xerxes, king of kings. This was the time when Xerxes was planning to cross the Hellespont and attack Greece. In order to prevent the Greeks from Syracuse and the cities in the heel of Italy from sending reinforcements to the mother country, Xerxes ordered the Carthaginians to land in Sicily and in the heel of Italy for the purpose of keeping the colonial Greeks at home. When one thinks of the staff work and prevision necessary to arrange such an operation, when it probably took the courier a year to get from Sardis to Carthage, we can give ourselves, with our instantaneous means of communication, less credit for good planning. On the other hand, the Carthaginian army, which landed at Agrigento and points west, and which numbered some 300,000 men, took 5 years to get to Syracuse, and having got there, suffered complete defeat and total annihilation. At a small road junction called Segesta, Hugh Gaffey and I saw the most beautiful Greek temple and theater that I have yet encountered. With the exception of the fact that the roof of this temple no longer exists, it is in a perfect state of preservation, and has been very little repaired. Since the Greeks were driven from this part of Sicily in 470 B.C., that is, some 2,500 years ago, the temple must have been built at an earlier date. There is one rather peculiar thing about this temple. The columns are not monolithic, or composed of 2 or 3 blocks, as is usually the case, but are built up of a number of small stones. It is further noteworthy that, after the lapse of 2½ millenniums, you cannot get a sharp knife edge between the joints and the stones. When I was about 8 years old, a minister named Mr. Bliss told me that when he visited the Parthenon, he had put his silk hat on one end of the steps, and having gone to the other end had sighted across and could not see the top of his silk hat, indicating that, in order to secure agreeable lines, the straight lines of the Greek temples were actually curves. Gaffey and I tried the same thing at Segesta with 2 steel helmets, one on top of the other, and were unable to see them over the curve of the steps. The theater, capable of seating perhaps 2,000 people, is on top of a very high hill, so that in addition to the view of the actors, the spectators also had ever before them a magnificent seascape. Apparently the Greeks who built this theater had lived in a village back of it, but owing to the inevitable cannibalism of all ancient things by succeeding generations, the town no longer exists and can be traced only by the fact that nearly all the stones lying over the hill show traces of having been worked. Speaking of cannibalism, I read that a great deal of Pisa is constructed with stone taken from Carthage. The city and harbor of Syracuse are to me of particular interest because this place probably has been the scene of more amphibious operations than any other harbor in the world. When looking over its water, I could almost see the Greek triremes, the Roman galleys, the Vandals, the Arabs, the Crusaders, the French, the English, and the Americans, who, to mention only a few, have successively stormed or attempted to storm that harbor. When we first came to Sicily, and the same thing is true of Sardinia and Corsica, we were surprised at the large number of small towers dotting the coastline. These towers were apparently built between 1500 and 1600 under the influence of Genoa. The system consisted of a man picking out for himself a good spot for a tower and building it. He would then go to the government and offer to garrison the tower, usually with himself and family, if he were paid. The pay was not excessive, in our money about $50 a year. Apparently that, and not the Arab pirates, is the origin of the towers. Another very striking characteristic, particularly of Sicily, is the fact that nearly all the towns cling like limpets to the tops of the precipitous peaks. On closer examination, you will find that the highest building on these peaks is the ruin of a Norman castle. The Normans captured Sicily between 900 and 970, and then, apparently, each Norman gentleman built himself a tower, for that is what most of them are, on the highest peak he could find. In the course of time, as his riches increased, he sometimes added an inner and then an outer bailey, but this is not the general rule. The town then grew from the descendants of his soldiers and from the local people who came close to the castle in order to secure protection. The Palais Royal at Palermo, the Palaeopolis of Polybius, had such an origin. Its site was a volcanic outcropping, surrounded by two streams on which the Arabs erected a castle called a Cassar. This outcropping, much manicured, still exists, and the original Cassar, built by the Arabs around 700 A.D., still forms part of the central keep of the palace. Unfortunately, the palace also has been over-manicured, and only in the basements and inner walls can one see the original building. In the basement of the old keep, we found the Norman treasury. It consisted of two stone rooms based on bedrock, one room completely within the other. In order to get into the inner room, it was necessary to open two doors and pass through a short vestibule. These doors were constructed so that when the outer door was opened, giving entrance to the hallway, the inner automatically shut. When the inner door was opened, the outer door was shut. Inside, there is a pit about 10 feet deep and 20 feet square, with a monolithic block in the bottom. On this block was piled the largest treasure, such as vases, dishes, and the like. In the four corners of the room are huge wine jars, which are suspended from the ceiling, so that a sentinel going down through a door could see that nobody had cut into the bottom of them. It was in these wine jars that the money was kept. When we were storming these towns or driving past them, I could almost picture in my mind's eye the small group of knights and men-at-arms who, by virtue of occupying these strong points, ruled the world as they knew it, and how pitifully weak in numbers and armor they were in comparison with our guns, tanks, and infantry, which rolled by them in endless streams. However, there were some things which the ancient knights and their ill-smelling companions would have understood and have laughed at. That was our improvised mule cavalry. In order to move over the terrific country through which we had to fight, we had to improvise mounted units. These men rode whatever they could find, mules, burros, and occasionally bullocks. The saddles were either of local construction, captured Italian equipment, or simply mattresses. Once I met a young soldier with a captured Italian saddle which he had casually placed on the horse's neck in front of the withers. When I stopped him to question his ideas in so placing the saddle, the horse lowered his neck and the soldier rolled off. He said that he thought that was the place to put a saddle. I suppose that the only time he had ever been on a quadruped was at a circus when he rode on an elephant's head. Nevertheless, this improvised horse cavalry was a tremendous advantage. In fact, we could not have won the war without it. We all regretted that we did not have a complete American cavalry division with pack artillery. Had we possessed such a unit, not a German would have escaped. The home life of the natives is very peculiar. Apparently, they have never decided to cook in any special place, so that all cooking is done in the streets. The cooking equipment has improved considerably since we came, as they now use our discarded 5-gallon oil cans. Not only do they cook in the street, but sit in the street, and what is more distressing, sing in the streets at all hours of the day and night. Owing to the fact that they live primarily on garlic, which is sold by old men carrying garlands of garlic over their shoulders, the singing not only impresses the ear, but also the nose. The Sicilian takes much better care of his animals than does the Arab, and he practically never uses a bit, all the horses and mules being controlled by a hackamore. Also, the Sicilian animals, being house-raised, are the most docile creatures I've ever seen. This also applies to the mules. To encourage these animals to pull or move forward, the Sicilian emits a noise between a belch and a groan. He has no verbal means of checking the horse because, whenever he stops groaning at it, the horse automatically halts. One very funny thing happened in connection with the Moroccan troops. A Sicilian came to me and said he had a complaint to make about the conduct of the Moroccans, or Gooms as they are called. He said that he well knew that all Gooms were thieves, also that they were murderers, and sometimes indulged in rape. These things he could understand and make allowances for, but when they came to his house, killed his rabbits, and then skinned them in the parlor, it was going too far. Since the greater portion of the Sicilian life is spent in sitting, it would naturally seem that after thousands of years he would have thought of making comfortable seats. But no, he sits on rocks, mud, boxes, or anything but chairs. However, they are a very cheerful people and seemingly contented with their filth, and it would be a mistake, in my opinion, to try to raise them to our standards, which they would neither appreciate nor enjoy. Corsica looks exactly as if you had taken the worst part of the Rocky Mountains and submerged it in the ocean. It is nothing but a succession of high, absolutely barren hilltops, composed of polished granite in the majority of cases. However, it has two striking characteristics. It is wholly French, and it has not suffered from the air. It is a distinct shock to arrive in a city which has not been blown up. Ajaccio is just as it was. Naples, on the other hand, has been very badly raided, but owing to the absolutely marvelous performances of our people, the docks are in fair working order. Pompeii comes up to the highest ideals of what a ruin should be. It also gives you the highest idea of the type of men who built it. It is very unfortunate that during our attacks it became necessary to bomb the ruins. Luckily, no very great damage was done. The flight into Egypt. Since it has been announced over the radio and also in the press that I have been to Cairo, I can now write about it. Colonel Codman, who was my aide throughout the war, myself and 8 other members of the staff of the 7th Army took off from Palermo at 07:15 December 12th and flew first to Benghazi, where we stopped to regas and to lunch. The airfield is about 15 miles from the town and is covered with small bomb and shell fragments, but otherwise is in fine condition. The country, while devoid of landmarks of any sort and practically without vegetation so that it requires navigational methods, is nevertheless quite rolling, and I believe there are few places where at a distance of 1,500 yards troops would not be invisible. It occurred to me that had it been possible to use them, observation balloons or even the old battery commander's ladders would have been very useful. The surface is a sort of hard-baked mud of a brownish color, and is much easier to traverse than is the sand around Indio. Indio is the United States Desert Training Center in California. However, after several vehicles have gone on any one track, the surface breaks up. This accounts for the fact that we were informed that in desert movement, vehicles should not follow in trace. However, in Indio, we found that it was much better to have them follow in trace. Certainly the country seems to me very much easier to operate in, particularly with armor, than is our own desert. From Benghazi, we flew straight across the desert to Tobruk, which is a very small and badly banged-up town with an artificial harbor full of wrecks. From Tobruk, we flew along the railway to El Alamein, and although we came close to the ground, we could see very few wrecked vehicles or guns and practically no wire. From El Alamein, we flew along the coast to Alexandria, and then up the Nile Delta to Cairo. There is a very striking demarcation between the green of the Nile Valley and the brown of the desert. I was informed that, except for the delta, which is about 150 miles wide, the rest of Egypt is less than 30 miles wide and some 2,500 miles long. It was quite a thrill as we approached Cairo to see the pyramids. We were met at the airfield by General Sir Henry Maitland Wilson's aide-de-camp, Major H. Chapman Walker. The aide took Codman and myself to the general's house, where we stayed during our entire visit. The general himself was absent when we arrived, but his former chief of staff and several officers lived at the house, which, while very unpretentious, is quite comfortable. It is situated about a 20-minute drive south of the city in a section called Mahdi. Major Chapman Walker had arranged a very complete program, which, after inspection, we approved. December 13th, 1943. Codman, myself, and Major Chapman Walker, accompanied by Lady Ranfurly, secretary to General Wilson, went on a shopping trip this morning. Cairo is really a disgusting place. It looks, and the people act, exactly as they did in New York in 1928. Both sides of the street are solid with automobiles, and there are other automobiles parked in the middle of the streets. All the stores are running full blast and seem to have plenty of goods to sell, but at terrific prices. For example, I priced a pair of silk stockings, which cost £4. The Egyptian peasant, who abounds in large numbers, is distinctly lower than the Sicilian, whom I had previously considered at the bottom of the human curve. When the Aswan Dam was constructed, it gave a certain type of freshwater snail a chance to develop in large numbers. This snail is the host for a sort of hookworm, which, since the construction of the dam, has become a menace. As a result of this hookworm, the Egyptian peasant constantly suffers from the bellyache and has his sexual vigor reduced. In order to relieve his pain and restore his vigor, he is taken to smoking hashish. This has the desired results for a few months, and then becomes impotent, and the peasant even more susceptible to the attack of the hookworm, so that he is in a vicious circle. Prior to the war, the traffic in hashish was well under control, with the result that the natives were quite discontented. But since the war, they have been able to get all the hashish they want and are now very happy. They are unspeakably dirty in their habits and in their dress. On the freshwater canal, I saw a man defecating in the water, while below him, at a distance of not more than 10 yards, women were washing clothes. And a short distance farther downstream, a village was drawing drinking water. Of the whole population of Egypt, some 1,200 own practically all the land except for a few million peasants who own approximately 4/5 of an acre apiece, while the rest own nothing. The average pay of a peasant is $50 a year, from which he has to rent his drinking water. The sailboats on the Nile have the same lines they had in the days of the ancient Egyptians, but since 762 A.D., they have adopted the Arab lateen sail in place of the square sail which they formerly used. In spite of their awkward appearance, these boats sail very well, and it is said that, when an English company brought out some specially constructed sailing barges which they thought would beat the native craft, the natives sailed circles around them. As far as I could determine, the native boats have no keel but a huge rudder which, in a sense, acts as a centerboard as well as a rudder. After we got through shopping, we had cocktails at the famous Shepherd's Hotel. The cocktails were good, but cost about $1.50 apiece. In the afternoon, we visited the British Tank School, which is interesting but not anywhere as well arranged as our schools at Knox or Benning. The Holy Land, December 14th, 1943. We took off by plane for Jerusalem at 0700 and crossed the canal just south of Lake Tennis, which is near where the children of Israel crossed. It never occurred to me until this flight that, at the time the Jews crossed, it was unnecessary for them to ford anything, because there is a stretch of desert from Bitter Lake to the Mediterranean which had no water on it. However, they did get across, and Napoleon crossed at about the same place and also lost his baggage when the wind shifted. From the canal, we flew along the line of Allenby's advance and crossed at Wadi El Arish, at the spot where the battle occurred. It is a much less formidable obstacle than I had gathered from the books. Beersheba and the surrounding country do not look too difficult, but certainly away from the wells the country is an absolute sand sea, and it is difficult to understand how Allenby ever moved a cavalry corps across it. From Beersheba we flew over Hebron and Bethlehem and turned westward just south of Jerusalem, finally landing at Akir near the coast, where we were met with some cars and driven 30 miles to Jerusalem. The only reason for calling Palestine a land of milk and honey is by comparison with the desert immediately surrounding it. It consists of nothing but barren, stony hills, on which a few olive trees eke out a precarious existence. We did not see a single beehive, although there were quite a number of mimosa trees. On reaching Jerusalem, we were met by Major General D.F. McConnell, who commands the district. He gave us a British priest, who had lived a long time in Jerusalem, as a guide to see the sights. We entered the city through the gate which Tancred stormed when the city was first taken, 1099 A.D. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre covers both the tomb of Christ and also the place where the cross stood. It is run by a composite group consisting of Catholics, Greeks, and Copts, and by a strange freak of chance, or British political insight, the doorkeeper is a Mohammedan. It struck me as an anomaly that, during my entire visit to Jerusalem, I was guarded by 4 Secret Service men, and the oddest part of it was that, when I entered the tomb, the Secret Service men came in with me. People must have very little confidence to fear assassination in such a place. From the tomb we went to the Crusaders' Chapel, where those who became Knights of Jerusalem were knighted. In this chapel is the sword which is supposed to have been used on these occasions. In my opinion, it is a fake, since the pommel is not of the correct shape, nor has it sufficient weight. The pommels of Crusaders' swords were usually carved in the form of a stone or a piece of lead, which in an earlier date had actually been tied there. This pommel was in the shape of a blunt acorn. The crossguard and the shape of the blade were correct. From here we went to the place where the cross had stood. Most of the mountain was cut away during the Roman occupation, when they filled up the tomb and erected a temple of Venus over both the mount and the tomb. However, there is an altar, which is supposed to be on the exact spot where the cross was erected. While I was in this chapel, I secured a rosary for Mary Scally and had it blessed on the altar. She had been my nurse and was now 96 years old. After we left the church, we followed the Way of the Cross, which is a dirty street, to the point where the Roman Forum had stood. I should think the distance is less than half a mile. In addition to the Stations of the Cross used by the Catholics, the Greeks have a number of extra ones, so that it is practically a day's trip for a Greek priest to walk down the street, as they have to stop in front of each station. From the Forum we got into the cars and drove to the Garden of Gethsemane, where there are still olive trees which may possibly have been in existence at the time of the crucifixion. After lunching with the commanding general, we drove back to the airfield and flew back to Cairo along the coast, passing over Gaza. Although I looked very carefully, I could see no indication of the fighting, but I did recognize the cactus hedge where the tanks got stuck. We reached Cairo just at dark, having completed in one day the trip which took the children of Israel 40 years to accomplish. On the 15th, it had been arranged for an eminent scholar to show us the sights, which we presumed were the pyramids. We went to Shepherd's Hotel to pick up this genius, but when I told him I wanted to go to the pyramids, he was shocked, and said that, though he had lived in Cairo for 40 years, he had been there only once, and the only things worth seeing in Cairo were the mosques. I told him I had seen all the mosques I wanted to and would have to dispense with his services. We drove to the pyramids and picked up a fairly fluent but very ignorant native guide. To me, the pyramids were quite disappointing. They are not as big nor as impressive as those around Mexico City. The Sphinx is in a poor state of preservation and rather smaller than I had expected. However, the rock temple at the foot of the Sphinx is a remarkable construction. Apparently, they piled up the rocks and then cut the chapels or tombs out of them. One of the tombs has a slab roof about 20 feet long by 6 feet wide by 2 feet thick, which has been slipped into notches and upright walls and is very highly polished. This polishing and chipping was all done with bronze chisels, the Egyptians having some method of tempering bronze, which has now been lost. At 5:30 I made a talk on landing operations to all the officers of the Middle East Command, some 500 in all. I believe that the talk went off quite well, as, contrary to the British custom, they applauded, and several of them wrote me letters, one of them saying that in all his previous military career he had not learned as much as in my 30-minute lecture. December 16, 1943. Major General Beaumont Nesbitt, in charge of visiting firemen, took me to Shepherd's Hotel, where we picked up the rest of the staff and drove for 2.5 hours along the freshwater canal to the Combined Operations Training Center, which is on the shores of the small, Bitter Lake. Apparently, the British were so interested in the talk I had given yesterday evening that they asked me to repeat it to some 200 student officers and Lieutenant General R.M. Scobie, who commands the British training there. The training center, while not nearly as large or as good as the one we had at Mostaganem, had 1 or 2 improvements over our methods. They had mock-ups of the sides of ships built out into the water, so that actual landing boats could come alongside, and the men could have the practice of going down the nettings into moving boats. On the way back we had a regular dust storm, and it was quite hard to see. General Sir Henry Maitland Wilson had returned and was at dinner. He is a very large man and quite jovial. I was more impressed with him than with almost any other British officer I've met. All of them, including the general, were very much interested in my reaction to General Montgomery, but I was very careful in what I said and refused to be drawn out. On the 17th, General Nesbitt took me to meet General Anders, who commands the Polish Second Corps. Accompanied by General Anders and the rest of our staff, we drove to the Polish camp near Fakus, which is on the eastern side of the Delta. We had a guard of honor of a very fine-looking group of soldiers. We then had lunch. At lunch, General Anders pinned on me the insignia of a Polish lieutenant general and the shoulder patch of the 2nd Polish Corps. Not to be outdone, I gave him one of my United States insignia and the shoulder patch of the 7th Army. He struck me as very much of a man. He was chief of staff of a Russian division in World War I. He has been hit 7 times and won the Polish decoration for valor twice. His troops are the best-looking troops, including British and American, that I've ever seen. He told me, laughing, that if his corps got in between a German and Russian army, they would have difficulty in deciding which they wanted to fight the most. After we had inspected the 2nd Polish Corps, Colonel Cummings and I drove to Alexandria, where we'd been invited by the commanding officer of the Levant, Vice Admiral Sir Arthur Willis. We crossed the whole of the Delta to get to Alexandria, but unfortunately, most of the trip was in the dark, so that we did not see a great deal. December 18th, 1943. At 10 o'clock, Colonel Moseley, who has ridden in the Grand National 4 times, called for us and took us to the Yacht Club, where we were met by an admiral and taken in a barge to inspect the harbor. We then visited the British Tank Repair Works, which is very imposing in size and uninspiring in organization and maintenance. Among other things, we found gaskets were made by hand. We drove back to Cairo across the desert, a distance of about 150 miles.